Hi, and welcome to Institute for Supply Management's LinkedIn Live series on the ISM Report on Business. My name is Dan Zeiger, and I'm a senior writer and copy editor for Inside Supply Management Magazine. That's ISM's member publications. Hope you were able to join us on Thursday for our discussion on the manufacturing PMI data. And if you didn't, the archive is easily findable on ISM's LinkedIn page, so be sure to check that out. But today, stick with us, because we're going to take a deep dive into the Services PMI number and the data for January. And once again, like we did on Thursday, we'll get our insights straight from the source. The chair of our Business Survey Committee for Services, his name is Anthony Nieves. The composite index reading of 53.4% beat expectations. It was powered by strong business activity and employment growth, but supplier deliveries slowed and prices climbed. So combine that with stronger than expected GDP growth for the U.S. in the fourth quarter of 2023 and a very positive federal jobs report for January. It's been a trifecta of good news lately. Not so much if you're banking on an interest rate cut in March, but we'll talk about all of that with Anthony Nieves. And the next 30 minutes will be an interactive experience. If you have a question, feel free to share it in the comment and the chat feature. And if we have time, we'll get to it. So we'll talk about the impact on the economy, and also importantly, we'll go on beyond that and just what purchasers and supply managers should also know about the data. So it's a treat to have Anthony Nieves with us. And Tony, I always enjoy talking to you. I always learn a lot. I'd love to hear your key takeaways from the January Services PMI data.
Thank you, Dan. Mm-hmm. Yes, as we look at the release this month, it did beat expectations, coming in at the 53.4, up 2.9 percentage points. And as you mentioned, it's attributed to the definite increase that we experienced in employment, going up 6.7 percentage points to 50.5. New orders up ever so slightly at 2.2 percentage points from the 52.8 to 55. And business activity moved at the same rate of growth, 55.8. Those are the four sub-indexes, along with supplier deliveries at 52.4, that comprise the PMI composite index. And when we look at these indexes and we break them down, and let's start with the business activity. We had seen that, and you have to keep in mind that we're measuring from the baseline of 50. Above 50 is growth, below 50 is contraction, and that baseline moves each month. So at the 55.8, that's the rate of growth from last month's 55.8. So it doesn't really reflect accurately when you see it only moved the percentage point change of 0.0. It's actually reflecting nice growth month over month. The same with new orders. So when we look at this in totality, right, and we understand that this is a very labor-intensive sector, employment at 50.5, that's a big story right there when we see that it went up 6.7 percentage points. And it could be even stronger, but our respondents are indicating that they're having difficulty in hiring, recruiting and hiring in certain industries. Now, keep in mind that certain other industries may be experiencing cutbacks, but in total, this sector is reflecting growth in the employment sector, or I should say in the employment index. So let me just break that down a little further. When we look at employment and we see that certain industries, as I said, are having difficulty in hiring, they're saying it's competitive in the marketplace, that it's tough to really find applicable workers to their needs, and that in other industries, they're saying that, yes, it's backfill is tough, but I think the biggest cutbacks we're seeing is in the technology sector.
Mm-hmm. Discuss that a little bit. Employment, it seems like that's the number one topic that comes up, because, the Services PMI comes out sometimes on the same day or, close to the federal jobs report day. And so those numbers are often watched very closely in tandem. Just talk about the tug of war. That it just seems like it's been that way for like the last year, or even since, the pandemic settled down, Tony. Some industries are having a lot more success than others. You cited technology specifically. Just talk about how that employment, has been a tug of war for many months now.
we get these numerous comments from our respondents, and that's where you really get a good insight as to what's happening in these companies and that comprise these various industries, the 18 industries that make up this sector. And it's very eclectic. Healthcare and social assistance, and we do a separate report, as you know, with the PMI there, and it's reflecting strong PMI in healthcare and social assistance. And it's one of the top 5 contributors to GDP in the country. So I think it's number 4, if I'm not mistaken. And then you look at professional, scientific, and technical services is probably, like, I think number 3, number 2 and number 3. But anyway, those industries are doing well. And then you look at some of the other industries that are having difficulty, like accommodation and food services. I've mentioned this on the monthly call, that because of the competitive nature of recruiting talent out there, that some of the more tedious driven jobs are having difficulty in finding workers. They're moving up. They're leveling up into probably less tedious work, or there's wage pressure that we saw all last year that we're not seeing as much this year, but it's still out there. And then companies are also indicating that people are looking at hybrid opportunities or remote work opportunities, that they don't have to go into an office and they don't need to be traveling to work, to and from work. So it's become, and as much as companies are trying to drive people back to the office, there's been some resistance there.
Was there any particular data point that surprised you, or maybe was a little bit higher or lower than you expected this month?
I look at the new orders index coming in at 55. If you look at historical trends in the services sector, and you have to think pre-pandemic, we typically had seen like a buildup going into December, and then it kind of went a little sideways. And then January, there was that post-holiday lull, and it picked up toward the latter part of the month of January. And then we saw February as being that robust month of where we would see growth. It seems to be happening a little earlier by seeing the new orders. And if I correlate back to respondent comments, what they're telling us is that new orders are being released, new projects coming online, capital spending as the release of capital funds. So this is happening a little earlier than what I would have anticipated based on those prior historical trends, as much as it's more aligned to that versus with during the pandemic and then post-pandemic, or coming out of the pandemic, we had all that pent-up demand that had driven a lot of activity in many of these indexes.
Yeah. Another thing that, as someone I know, I take part in the monthly call that you do, and you see your interviews on television. One of the things that you regularly get asked is about interest rates. So I'll ask you. Obviously, there's been a lot of good economic news lately, and I saw a report earlier today in regards to the Services PMI data. The host on TV, pretty much said that this was the final nail in the coffin. If you were hoping for an interest rate cut in March, it looks like that's not going to happen, especially based on what Chairman Powell said last night on 60 Minutes. Just as someone, as just an observer, as we say, we're not with the Fed or anything like that, but just an observer, just what's your take on our data, the ISM data, and the impact that it could have on what the Federal Reserve does?
Well, it's a great question, Dan, and I think that the Federal Reserve looks at ISM data. They look at our report. It's not the sole criteria that they use for basing their decisions. However, it's a significant component of their criteria. And looking at it, especially when I first saw the data and the prices index came in strong at, increasing 7.3 percentage points to 64. My first thought was, okay, they may put a hold on rate cuts. If anything, I was hoping they wouldn't increase the rate. And they're trying to stave off inflation, right? That's one of their primary objectives of the Federal Reserve is, besides as we know, the monetary policy is that they definitely influence employment. They manage inflation. So that's some of their primary objectives. And looking at the way that prices went, And even though fuel prices have come down, they're still significantly higher than where they were in the past. So I think that this report and other information contributed to them not lowering rates. And they said they would do multiple rate cuts. Their last FOMC meeting, they indicated that, again, no cutbacks on the rate, but at least they didn't increase them. And I was a bit concerned because this, even though prices at 64 is not where it was earlier in like 2023 when we were seeing it up in over the 70 percentile range for that index, it's still, I would like to see it below 60 so that they can continue on that path of rate cuts.
Yeah, you mentioned fuel as, it's always an inflation driver in the services sector, though you mentioned, there was some relief a little bit. Labor, 38 consecutive months, I think now up in price. That's always a nagging concern. Was there any particular commodity or anything, any element of the prices index that caught your eye that might have been the result of that reading that was a little bit higher than might have been expected?
There's two things that caught my eye. And one, looking at the PVC and some of the other poly products, which are derivatives of petroleum-based type products, and that is correlated back to fuel costs. So even though fuel is down, it's still higher than where it was in prior years or even last year. So I think that's impacting the cost of materials in that specific product categories. The other big one, we see food and catering, right? We've had food and beverage in there successive months. And I always like to correlate back for people to understand how this is impacting us. Food costs, right? Whether it be on the commercial side or the retail side. If you go to the supermarket today, you can see the cost of food and your cost of groceries, how much more expensive it is than it was in prior periods of time, prior years. And we knew we had availability issues during the pandemic. Capacity definitely improved, but we're still seeing the change in pack sizes, the increase in unit cost. And, I saw a meme the other day that struck me to be humorous. And they said, what is the most expensive mode of transport these days? The shopping cart, right? So you go to the supermarket and your food costs you so much more. It's amazing how much more we're paying for groceries and whatnot. And then you look on the application to the commercial side of things, restaurants specifically. If you go to a dine at a restaurant, you know that menu prices have increased and people are up in arms about it. Yet also correlated with that is the decrease in portion size. So this is what they're trying to do to stave off the what they call COGS, of cost of goods sold in the hospitality industry.
Right. Hey, let's talk about inventories for a little bit. Specifically, I know that the inventories index itself remained in slight contraction for another month, and then we have another index that works kind of in tandem with it, called the Inventory Sentiment Index, and that's an index that we get a lot of questions on, exactly what that means and what it measures. And, when the Services PMI data started, I believe it was in 1997, that index was in expansion for over 270 months. It took the pandemic to get our survey respondents to feel that their inventories were a little too low. And now it's back in expansion. Just talk about a little bit how those two indexes work together, and just what insights can you take from the data this month. The inventory index 49.1% and inventory sentiment 59.3%. So that's our respondents feel that very strongly that their inventory levels are too high at the moment.
Great question, and I think that to explain it, and I have to start with the fundamentals behind it for services. So many companies, they either don't count or measure inventories. However, it doesn't mean they don't use inventory, right? It's just a matter of sometimes in the services sector, they'll have them and they'll just use it as a direct expense versus having it physically counted on a consistent basis. And this sector is more demand pull. So you have shorter cycle times than you do on the manufacturing side. So it's more hand to mouth on the buying activity. But putting that all into perspective, it's still about cash liquidity. It's still about inventory turnovers. It's still about the concerted effort of working down inventories toward year end. And it's more from fiscal responsibility and managing their dollars and the cash flow. Now let's look back to inventory sentiment and how that correlates to inventory. So inventory is what they're directly measuring. The sentiment is about how they feel those inventory levels are applicable to their business needs or their business requirements. And that's a key difference. And this index, to give you a little background on it, is something the Federal Reserve actually asked us to include in the ROB, in the report on business. And because of that, I think that the psyche of the supply managers in the past were always like, any inventory was too high. So we said, okay, let's define it even further and say, not just how you feel about your inventories, but really how do they correlate back to your business needs. So what they're telling us this month is that, yes, they've cut back on inventories, and there's been a concerted effort toward year end of getting inventories lower. And it's also burning off some of the personal protective equipment that was stockpiled during the pandemic, that we even get comments to this day that they're trying to work off or liquidate and get rid of some of that. And they're still using it because we still have cases of COVID, and we have other types of diseases and illnesses that people are very conscious of. You still see some people wearing masks out there and whatnot. But again, and overall, and looking at the inventory, yes, it's cut back, but then applying it back to, or correlating it back to where their needs are today and what they're utilizing, they're saying they're still higher than where they'd like them to be. So that's the long drawn out explanation of between the two indexes.
Yeah. Another index that you had mentioned it's one of the four that factors directly into the services PMI is supplier deliveries, and that came into expansion at 52.4%. It had been in contraction or slowing territory pretty regularly in the last year. And for those that don't know, that is an index that is inversed. If it's above 50%, that means deliveries are typically slower, which you would expect as demand improves and the economy improves and demand expands. Now it's above 50% at 52.4, suggesting slower deliveries. And I know you've heard the citations, the colder weather in the United States has played a factor potentially. What's going on in the Red Sea right now and the drought at the Panama Canal might also have an impact. Just, what's your read on it in terms of the comments, that we got from our survey respondents, and just the impact it might have had on that, those potential disruptions might have had on the index.
And you raise some good points, and looking at that supplier deliveries index, when deliveries are slowing, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, as long as it's not purely capacity related. And that's what we had seen during the pandemic. It was capacity issues. It was upstream in the supply chain, and that was slowing delivery significantly. But as things have come back online and we don't have the capacity issues that we had in the past, and deliveries became faster as demand kind of waned, as because we had that pent up demand coming out of the pandemic, and things kind of leveled off and the demand waned for a little bit there, and deliveries got faster. And then we also had improved modes of transport. But now what the respondents are indicating, it's slow across the board. We've had slow rail deliveries in the past. This sector, like even on the manufacturing side, is very reliant on overland trucking. You mentioned weather. That did bog down a bit of the transportation of moving of goods, tangible goods, that is. And then, we have to look at this, 2/3 of our population in the country, it's on either the eastern or western seaboard, right? So in back east, when they had all those weather issues, it definitely slowed transport. And then you mentioned the Red Sea. Yes, definitely issues there, especially with terrorist activities. And the drought in Panama, the actual flow through of ships going through the Panama Canal is less than half of what it was prior to the drought. And it has to do with the water basin that feeds into the lock system over in the Panama Canal is definitely impacting things. And again, that all of it contributes to what we're seeing today. And hopefully, as we get past this weather front, and we're experiencing one now here in California, it's definitely it's like it started raining literally 3 days ago and it hasn't stopped, and it's supposed to continue all the way through Thursday here. And we've had some bad weather even in the Midwest with snow and whatnot. The Northeast has been hammered a bit. So we should see supplier deliveries somewhat around here. I don't think it'll contract anytime soon. But overall, it is one of the, if you look at the indexes that make up the composite, it's 25% of the weight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, looking big picture, when the ISM semi-annual economic forecast came out in December, the survey respondents had expressed some concern that there might be some pullback in growth in the services sector early in the year. Does this reading, the reading higher than expected in January, kind of give you some encouragement that might be avoided? Just to take a big picture look at where the services sector stands right now.
Yes, and the semi-annual, our respondents indicated that for services that we would see some growth year over year, but it would happen in the latter part, the second half, that the first half wouldn't be as good as the first half wouldn't be as good as the second half. And all indications are we're a little bit ahead of the curve based on what was anticipated or projected by the respondents. And, there's still some noise around potential recession, right? And I was asked a question earlier today that I think because of the release this month, were there chances of this overheating? And it seems so contrary to some folks indicating that we might see recession. Some are projecting toward maybe the third, fourth quarter. And now to be asked a question about overheating, it's certainly not there. We're, in the middling of, we're right at that midpoint of the 50 midpoint, 53.4, we're under the midpoint. But overall, looking at business activity and new orders being right in the middle of that, I think that we're in a good place right now for continued incremental growth. And as long as it looks like everything is staying consistent with what our respondents said, just slightly above where they thought we might be at this point in time. And that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is going to be I think one of the fun questions that we get to talk about every month. And like I said to Tim Fiore on Thursday when he was breaking down the manufacturing numbers, you and Tim, sprinkle insights throughout, the call on what purchasing professionals or supply managers should know about the data and how they can use it. But just kind of to put it into bullet points and to give it a synopsis, if I'm a purchasing professional or a supply manager, what insights can I glean from the data? What should I know about what happened in January with the PMI numbers?
Well, I always say that you look at these indexes and there's some that are leading and some that are lagging. But the most important thing about this report is that it gives you information that is released quicker than anything else out there associated with the supply chain and supply management professionals. And the respondents that comprise our committee, they all work in various enterprises, and their contribution to GDP is the composition of our business survey committees. So if you look at this report and how it maps against GDP historically, it's a mirror image, and it goes for both sectors. And so the real-time information that you can glean from this is especially looking at commodities and looking at what the respondents are indicating to us, what's happening. And it helps you in planning things and whether you need to keep your powder dry in the storm, or is it an opportunity for forward buying, or do we have to hedge? And looking at strategy development for supply chain issues, our respondents are coming across from all these 18 industries that comprise this sector. And if you look at it, they're all interrelated. I always say, like, if you look at the manufacturing side, I look at the manufacturing report because upstream, they are supplier providers to the services sector, and service sector companies provide services to manufacturing. So you have to look at it, even though I like to brag about the fact that services is definitely the larger component of contribution to the economy. They're interrelated and intertwined, and so they're interdependent as well. So you glean information from both sectors to help you make decisions and strategy decisions as you manage the supply chain.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll be a great topic of discussion for a future edition of this. About how the services makes up almost 90% of the economy, and how the services PMI data factors into that. That would be a great topic of discussion for perhaps our next month's call. But yeah, Tony, this has been great. I appreciate your time, and I've learned a lot. Is there anything that we haven't talked about, or that I haven't asked that you think might be important to note about this month's data that we should talk about?
I think just to touch briefly on exports and imports.
Sure.
Even though exports is not a big component for services, but when you look at export, it mostly comes from the knowledge management arena, which would be that professional scientific technical services, management of companies and support services, information. Those are big areas, less reliant on the, you would say, tangible goods and exchange rates. And then on imports, I was surprised by how imports had a nice big swing, because typically we see imports in the month of January pull back a bit because of the Chinese New Year and the reliance on products being imported from Asia. But we've had supply routes switch from the pandemic, looking for alternate sources. So that was surprising for me to see both of those come up as strong as they did.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot. Thanks again, Anthony. I really appreciate it. Enjoyed talking to you about this month's report. And yeah, I think we've stumbled into something fun here to talk about every month with you and Tim on the manufacturing and the services data when it comes out. So yeah, be sure to look for the manufacturing PMI discussion. If you happen to miss it on Thursday, we have it archived at ISM's LinkedIn site. And then you can catch this on our archive as well in case you missed part of it. And then also go to ismworld.org, and we'll also have articles every day that go up on the day that the manufacturing services and our hospital PMI data are released. It's called the Report on Business Roundup. Kind of sums up things that we've talked about here and some other goodies. So be sure to look for that. But yeah, thanks for joining us. For Anthony Nieves and a couple people who helped us great behind the scenes today, Angela Miller and Christina Cahill. Thanks for joining us for this breakdown of the Services PMI data for January, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.